If you do a Google search for Max Schulman's classic short story, Love is a Fallacy, you'll find a very humorous story published in 1951 about a very smart student who feels he needs to teach a very lovely but dense young woman about logic. He proceeds to, in his words, teach her to think. Essentially, he teaches her about fallacies. The goal of this video lecture is not to give you a crash course in all the fallacies that exist, because that would take forever, and besides, that's what class lecture is for, but to give you a brief introduction as to what fallacies are, the classifications of fallacies, the difference between valid and sound arguments, and a few important notes that will help you on your way to understanding the many types of fallacies. Fallacies have been called the dark side of arguments, but I'm sure we can get a better definition than that. Google is a wondrous invention. You just type in the words fallacy definition and this pops up. It's from the Oxford Dictionaries online. But let me give you a more simple definition of a fallacy as a mistake in reasoning. Another way to describe it is as an incorrect argument in logic and rhetoric which results in a lack of validity, or more generally, a lack of soundness. A fallacious argument, then, is an argument that contains a mistake in reasoning, or a statement or series of statements that contains a fallacy. But let's get back to the lack of validity and lack of soundness. For that, we need to take a brief trip down memory lane to a discussion of logic. You'll recall that a syllogism is a systematic arrangement of arguments consisting of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. We consider this a logical argument. And you'll further recall that you can have categorical syllogisms, disjunctive syllogisms, and conditional or hypothetical syllogisms. And one more jog on your memory. An enthymeme is a truncated syllogism where one or more of the premises is implied. For example, you might state the major premise and the conclusion, leaving out the minor premise, as in every A is a B, so every C is B. Or you might leave out the major premise, just stating the minor premise and the conclusion. Or just the conclusion. You might even state the premises and let us draw our own conclusion. Regardless, in order for an enthymeme to make sense to us, as the audience, we have to supply the missing premise or the missing conclusion. Quick example. If I say, nothing relieves pain faster than aspirin, so I think I'll have to buy some aspirin, you would probably assume or conclude that I am in pain. But I could just as easily say, I need to buy some aspirin, and you would also supply the missing premises that not only am I in pain, but that aspirin would relieve that pain. Some scholars call this process of the receiver supplying the missing premise message co-creation, as the sender and the receiver are creating the message together. Okay, now let's talk about how fallacies can be classified. Again, hearkening back to your studies of logic. Fallacies can be subdivided based upon the type of reasoning, deductive or inductive. You'll remember that deductive reasoning is taking a general conclusion and applying it to specific cases, as in, the class average was a B, so you must have earned a B. And you'll also recall that inductive reasoning works the other way around, taking specific cases and drawing conclusions from those, as in, you got a B in that class, so did Juan and Margaret. Wow, everyone in the class got a B. One more, and perhaps the most common classification, is based upon formality. A formal fallacy is an error in logic that can be seen in the argument's form or structure. This means that if the logic is wrong, as in this case, hey, where did that D come from? The logic doesn't make sense. Well, then it is a formal fallacy. You can think of a fallacy as a non sequitur. Again, thanks to Google and the Oxford Dictionaries, that means a conclusion or statement that does not logically follow from the previous argument or statement. Informal fallacies are arguments that are fallacious, not due to flaws in the argument structure, but due to errors in the argument's content. A quick example of the difference. This argument about septuagenarians, and yes, that's a real word, is correct in form, because the conclusion follows logically from the premises, so it's not a formal fallacy. But what if my mother was 81, not in her 70s? Then the error is in the content, not the form, so it would be an informal fallacy. Okay, she is in fact 76 at the moment, so technically there's no fallacy here, but I think you get the point. That finally brings us to valid and sound arguments. When we're talking about validity, we are referring to the argument's form. If it is not valid, in other words, when you diagram it, the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premise, it would be a formal fallacy. A sound argument, however, must not only be valid, it follows the correct form, but the content must also be true, meaning that the content of the argument must be free of fallacies. And finally, remember that an argument containing a fallacy or a mistake in reasoning may still be correct by chance. I could accuse you of not studying by using the following logic. Students who come to class usually do well in my class. Your attendance is poor in my class. Therefore, you must not be doing well in my class. Well, the argument is correct in form. It's a valid argument. But maybe you have been coming to class and my records are wrong. Regardless, if your grades aren't so hot, the conclusion may be correct even though the second premise may be incorrect. There are any number of reasons unrelated to attendance that could contribute to poor grades, so the conclusion of a fallacious argument could still be correct by chance. Almost done. Just a few more important notes, the first being who can commit a fallacy. Obviously, if you are the speaker or the sender of a message, you can commit a fallacy by setting forth a fallacious argument. But those who reason fallaciously by accepting a fallacious argument as a sound one are just as guilty of committing a fallacy as those who use such an argument to attempt to convince others of a particular point of view. That means that you, as a listener or receiver of a fallacious argument, can also be guilty of committing a fallacy. That's why it's important to be a critical receiver of messages so you don't make decisions based upon fallacious reasoning. Which leads me to fallacies can be intentional or unintentional. Some fallacies are committed intentionally. There are some people who manipulate or persuade via deception, while other fallacies are committed unintentionally due to carelessness or ignorance. As poet and playwright Michael Bassey Johnson once observed, a wise man can say a foolish thing at any time, anywhere, and to anybody. So again, regardless of intent, you may still be guilty of a fallacy. Names of fallacies will differ based upon textbook or professor. That means it's not enough to just be able to name the fallacy, but you must be able to explain why the argument is fallacious. If you are talking to your young niece or nephew, you can't just blurt out, "Hey, that's a post hoc ergo propter hoc argument." You have to be able to explain that just because your alarm went off before the sun rose doesn't mean that your alarm caused the sun to rise. And lastly, fallacies can overlap, meaning that one statement could include more than one fallacy. Processing time. What is a fallacy? What does formal logic have to do with fallacies? Is a valid argument necessarily true or a sound argument? You should now have the foundation to begin a more in-depth study of fallacies. Soon you'll be tossing around terms like abusive ad hominem, red herring, ad misericordiam, and even post hoc ergo propter hoc, as if you know what you're talking about. And you will.